right, hi everyone. I'm here with the amazing artist and educator at Lesley University, Vivian Boy, who is here to speak with me a little bit about her work, particularly her most recent work that is being highlighted on the Lesley webpage, but also is kind of doing getting a lot of exposure in multiple levels because you're also the 2017 Massachusetts Art Educator of the Year recipient.
For higher education.
For higher education. So congratulations. And in representing that. So a lot of things to talk about here. But what we really just want to do is find out a little bit more about why you do the work that you do in the way that you do it. I mean, yeah, no pressure, right? Like
that's
huge. and maybe this can be a series of conversations, right? But what I want to do is really kind of elevate people of color, but particularly Latino voices around, or Latinx voices rather, around the art making process. So tell us a little bit about it's Crossing Borders.
Crossing Borders.
Right? Mm-hmm. And how you conceptualized it, what it is, and what it means to you.
Yeah, so I had been thinking for a long time of doing an exhibition about immigration. I felt like it was something that was not getting a lot of attention a year ago, right? This was a long time ago. And I had been thinking about doing that exhibition, and as soon as the president rescinded DACA, I said, we need to do it. We were expecting to do it. It was scheduled to happen in the spring. And my graduate assistant, Amanda Miller, and I decided to push it up. And so we started, I had thought about particular artists that I knew that were doing very interesting work. But Amanda, thought, let's actually, what if we expand beyond Lesley? And so we said, great, let's do it. So we put out a call. It came together very, very quickly. It took about 2 weeks. We put out a call. We said, who's doing work? Who's doing work about this? Who's out there? We didn't know. I mean, I could invite people I knew, but we wanted to know who was out there. So we put out a white call, which apparently really made the rounds. And had a very short deadline, 2 weeks. So it didn't work.
The urgency.
Exactly. It was basically, artists.
Well, but talk about like the metaphor of the urgency of the situation.
Exactly.
Politically,
yes.
right?
Absolutely. I mean, it had to happen immediately.
Exactly.
Or it would have had to wait months, right?
Right.
So we put it out. We said, artists whose identity has been impacted by immigration and who have developed a portfolio about it. And we asked for at least 3 works because we wanted to make sure we weren't going to get people who did one project in a class one day. But we also agreed, unusually, that we wouldn't jury it. We would accept every single artist who submitted because we wanted to be really inclusive of their voices. And so we put it out there and we got, I think it's like 15 artists, and they range from college students to professional artists, and then we also invited kids from Artworks in Lynn. So there were 5 videos from high school students from Lynn that were about their own stories of going back home. So that's how it started. And then once we received the work and we asked for the statements, we did not edit them. We included the statements exactly as every artist gave it to us, and we try to maintain the work as honest as possible, right? I mean, you always shape the narrative by the way you hang in some ways, but it was a challenging, it's a challenging show to hang, but the idea was to be as inclusive as possible. Anybody who sent work was accepted, and let's represent them as they want to be represented, rather than, turn their statements into some kind of into some kind of gallery thing.
Right.
And then as part of that, something that I had been wanting to do for a long time as well was the immigration timeline. And so we decided to do it as part of the exhibition. How do we invite others to also provide their own experiences and be able to write them out? So we created that timeline around the windows, right adjacent to the exhibition. And I mean, transcribing the timeline before I cleaned it up was very powerful because it was really amazing. I mean, there's stories of, you know, the uncle who was crossing the border and was detained and never made it. The stories of like the first time I came to the U.S. and, you know, one person who wrote, I had no idea that being Muslim here was such a huge deal. So it was just really interesting to be able to see also the range of the people that come to our building that we don't know. There are people who had stories about their ancestors being removed during their Indian Removal Act. So it was just very, I mean, just to be able to see that develop was very, it was emotional. It was
absolutely as it should be.
Yeah.
As it is.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
For us to kind of really see what we're doing to each other.
Yes.
In these forms, right? In the art forms that can really be such a mirror for us in our interior psychological landscape, but also this kind of socio-political landscape.
And also how complicated it is, right? And how complex and how nuanced. Because that was the other thing. So some of the artists are dreamers. Some of the artists are people who are writing about immigration stories from past generations, right? And so you have a whole range of people whose experience is very, very different from each other. It's like a very wide range of experience. But it all comes down to these stories of survival in some ways, you know?
Yes.
And stories about understanding how our histories shape us and stories about understanding who is here in this space. I mean, Lesley is a private university, so you know you're not getting the wider public.
Right.
And even then, it was really amazing to see who is there, because I think that most of the community that became visible, I think it's largely invisible at the university.
Oh, absolutely. I think not just at Lesley, right, but in definitely in private higher education. So tell me a little bit about like making things visible and what it's been like for you as a educator in higher ed, right? To like, what is now what you want to make visible, considering all this? I mean, we are in the time of DACA, right? Like right now, it's the most uncertain it's ever been, with the temporary extension just kind of passing us by and it being usurped by other news. Yeah. Right.
I mean, I think that one of the most pressing things at the moment is, I think there's a really huge dehumanization happening of immigrants. It's criminalizing immigrants by simply saying,
absolutely,
if you came here without papers, you're a criminal, and if you're a criminal, then you can be treated any which way and you should have no rights. I mean, you do hear people saying that immigrants have no rights, and which is not in fact the case.
Right.
Right. Even if you're undocumented, you do have rights.
Of course. Yeah,
but this dehumanization, I think that part of what art can do is humanize, right? Is show people that every person that is here is a person, and it's a human being with a family, with loved ones, who struggles, who strives, and not being reduced to one definition, being reduced to immigrant, you know?
Right. And which is so interesting in the Latinx context too, I would argue, right? In the sense that there's the immigrant, but then there's also what I would say is really what we are, especially from Central America now, currently, or the DACA, or the Dreamers, right? Or anyone really from the Caribbean, or is refugees.
Yes.
Right? Maybe not necessarily because of a kind of defined war, but narco-terrorism is alive and well in many of our countries, and people are escaping, fleeing literal war zones in this
literally
way.
For their lives.
Absolutely.
And the lives of their children.
Absolutely. And I think that this kind of political distinction between even like the rights, quote unquote, of a refugee versus an immigrant is also such an interesting kind of conversation. But
But even those are being blurred.
Right.
I mean, even those
Right.
are actually being erased.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the sense that we see everybody as human, but rather in the sense that it doesn't matter how you come in or why.
We don't want you.
We don't want you. I mean, when you see refugees, even people who are seeking refugee status,
Asylum,
being
right.
separated from children at the border.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What says more that you don't matter than that? Than isolating kids from their parents?
And yes, absolutely.
After
I mean,
they've been traumatized.
I mean, oh my God, right? And then also even here now, kind of pitting families. I do a lot of pro bono work with families who are struggling with these issues right now, and young people who are really bicultural and bilingual, but identify as quote unquote American,
Mm-hmm.
but the feelings, these seeds, these toxic seeds that are being sown even into the minds of these young people against their own parents.
Yes.
Right? That okay, we'll elevate the dreamers and save the dreamers, but it's the parents
At the
that
expense
of
right.
the parents,
Exactly.
right? And so this kind of fracturing and splitting of the family in these kind of really awful kind of ripple effects, right? Of dehumanizing people.
Yeah.
Right. Which is like a classic legacy, I think, in the United States, right? Is separating
Divide
families.
and conquer, right?
Divide and conquer,
Yeah.
right? Really colonial, kind of neo-colonial legacies. So tell me then a little bit about your work too, like your arts-based research in particular is something that I'm super curious about.
Yeah. So, I mean, in my work, well, I'd have to go back quite a bit. So I was born in Mexico. My parents were Cuban exiles, but I was born American, sort of a historical fluke. My parents were already American by the time I was born. So I was born an American citizen in Mexico of Cuban parents. And after that, I lived in Guatemala, Colombia, and then Miami. And, for a very long time, I just felt like I was Mexican. And eventually, I began to really see myself as Cuban, which was an interesting transition. And one that I accepted kind of reluctantly at some point, interestingly, but I have become, I feel like my identity more and more, Cuba is the one thing that has been consistent in my entire life, even though I had never been there, right? I mean, having never stepped in Cuba, but all the stories, all the food, all the family, everything in my life was very much consistently about Cuba. So even if you move around a lot, there's this one thread that just keeps you tethered to this place that you've never even stepped in, Until recently, I have gone twice now.
That's great.
But so in my graduate work, I started really tackling that, especially the issue of cultural authenticity. This thing that, because there was a lot of talk at that time. This was in the 90s about assimilation and cultural authenticity. And I felt like, well, we assimilate one way or another. Like, you have to function,
Right.
And everybody seems to be about it. Oh, yeah, of course, everybody's for authenticity. But what does that mean, right?
Right.
So,
it's one of those terms.
I mean, when you come from, when you're not authentically anything, you begin to, so then what does that make me if I'm not like authentically Cuban? Because, or I'm not authentically Mexican, or I'm not authentically American.
Interesting.
So that became the basis of that work, which was on fictional grounds and culinary maps. And I took the Cuban sandwich because it has been, because it's a sandwich that, it has Cuban bread, pork, Swiss cheese, pickles, mustard, and wherever you go, they make it a little differently, and they add other things. And I used to get very upset that was not really a Cuban sandwich.
Interesting.
So when I started thinking about the Cuban sandwich, and I did a little research about food, I realized that anything in the Cuban sandwich didn't exist before Columbus. And my friend Vladimir had just left Cuba, and he said, "Oh, unless you're a tourist." This was in the 90s. Unless you're a tourist, you can't get a Cuban sandwich. I mean, who can get a sandwich that has pork and ham and Swiss cheese in Cuba, right?
I know, totally.
And so I started thinking about, well, how authentic is the Cuban sandwich?
Wow.
So I used that as a basis. And then I did research about a lot of the food that we eat. And thinking about, again, what is authentically from anywhere, right? I mean, potatoes are from the Americas. Tomatoes are from the Americas. I mean, there were no tomatoes in Italy.
That's
There
right.
were no potatoes in Ireland or Russia before Columbus.
Yes.
I mean, these are recent.
That's real stuff. Like I tell people all the time, because my father is also from the Mediterranean, from Sardinia. He doesn't consider himself Italian, although it was conquered. The island was conquered. That the main dish in Italy that Italians are known for are spaghetti with tomato sauce, and the noodles came from Asia, and the tomatoes came from the indigenous lands of North and South America. And he's like, we've just like kind of co-opted culinary identity.
And the reality is that I think that that's true about everything.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how many of us really can say that we come from a single place?
Right.
But I think what happens is that we claim this territory, right? And then we attach all this stuff to it. And then we defend that with everything we have.
Well, I think for me, this is my research, right, is that I argue that like colonization has also been internalized. And so the need to claim, the need to kind of own, right, is actually become a part of a narrative that isn't necessarily part of the human experience or human DNA even. And I think we still have time to repair those ruptures, right? Because it's since Columbus or since this colonizing of the rest of the world, quote unquote, right?
And in fact, I think that that's what's very much at play right now, which is I keep going back and I'm amazed. Like I thought, I did that work in 1995, you know, and I left it behind. And now I'm like, wow, this work is more relevant now even than it was then. Thinking of, because that work was about, well, what does it mean to be an American? And I'm an American. What does that mean, right? And I think that we're understanding that that people here have very different expectations of what that means.
Yeah.
But also the idea suddenly that if you're not American, then you don't have the same claim to humanity. And by American, I mean whatever it is that people mean by American, right? Because it's not even about not even about citizenship. It's like this sense that, you know, that only Americans hold these privileges or these rights even, or, you know.
Fascinating. Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to just say, I thought it would be more about U.S. citizens, right, that identity. But it's so interesting to hear say it's not just or not even about that, right? And, yeah, I think this transnational context, too, that we're becoming more and more, I don't know, aware of, or that it's just happening, right, since 1995, right, for a variety of different reasons, both, you know, how monolithic corporations have kind of like taken over the world, how, you know, so many reasons, right? But I'm just kind of then wondering also, I mean, we could just talk forever, right? But the last thing I do kind of want to get a little bit of a taste of from you right now for this conversation is, you know, and you know a little bit about my work about this question, are the arts really a universal language? And kind of tying it up kind of here with some of your thoughts about, is it, isn't it, is it something else, is it evolving, is it, what are your thoughts on that question?
I have a hard time seeing the arts as a universal language.
Me too.
You know, because the syntax of artwork comes from your experience and your own sense of what things mean. And if what I think something means is different than what you think that thing means, there's no way you're going to look at my work and understand what I'm referencing even, right? Even something as simple as a reference. If you don't know my references, then you can't really decode the work. You can't get at the heart of the work.
Right.
And we all come from different places that have different references. I mean, and I think in some ways we've bought into, again, this sort of internationalist artwork, art scene that seems to level everything. But I don't see art as being a universal language any more than any language is a universal language.
Exactly. Unless we're thinking about it as a dominant language, right? Like English, and as a conquering language.
Right, but then you're just thinking about, okay, then it's a hegemonic language.
Right.
It's not a universal language.
Right.
I mean, anything that,
correct.
you know, and even, yeah, I mean, even if you, it's like another language, right? If you learn that other language, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are, that language is part of you.
Yeah.
You know, and I think art comes so deeply from our experience.
Yeah.
I don't think it's easy to translate.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's almost more treacherous because we think we see an image and we think we understand it. And there's so much we don't even know that we don't know.
Well, exactly. And I think that's something that we've also perpetuated, maybe more so in a kind of a Eurocentric frame or a Western frame, if we even want to call it that, right? That, that what are we elevating? What are we looking at? How are we seeing it? What biases then do we also not even realize that we're not even acknowledging? There's a whole other world of aesthetics. There's a whole other world out there of multiple types of quote unquote artistry, skill, right? Especially if I think of my abuelita and her artistry was something that would be more so now considered maybe like folk art in the United States, right? These kind of like these weavings, these tapestries, these, which, you know, is just a whole other amazing metaphor. It's a whole other thread. So maybe we'll end with that. How are we going to keep threading? What are our threads? How are we weaving things together? And how are we also... when do we also need to maybe pull that stray thread and let things also unravel and come apart to reweave, right? Or do we allow that mistake in the pattern to exist?
But when do we get to pull that thread just to see it clearly? You know, in the middle of everything else,
to open it up. And so maybe that's the final thing, like. Seeing clearly, right, that's what we're trying to make visible. What are we seeing, right? And I want to acknowledge, like, it's a little bit of an ableist metaphor, right, in the sense that I just want to name that, right? Because even in our own language, we need new language, I feel like.
We do.
About how humans experience the world and what we value and what's important. Right? Because in psychology, like, what do we see, right?
Yeah.
What does that even mean in a world where most of the people also have no access to cataract surgery and are going blind, right?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for them? And I mean, I could just go on.
I know. In a way, you begin to, like, how do we perceive, right? Maybe perception is
the new...
more... I don't know. It's another way of thinking about. We perceive through so many different ways, through all our senses, and really, I mean, so many, you know.
Right, and so and that's also has the lenses of our historical narratives
and ancestral, and your current experience and your ancestral historical narratives.
Exactly, and so then it really becomes also a question of impact too. Like how we perceive something is just as valid how it impacts me, rather than its intention, of like how it's supposed to impact you, right? Because I think this conversation can continue, but it's such an interesting conversation around arts because people say, "Oh, that's not what I meant by it," or "That's not what I intended." And especially as a person of color, whether it's in an arts-based context of a art critique or a jury, versus even just a microaggression, right? Addressing a microaggression to someone, and they say that back to me, it shuts down the conversation, right? Because it makes it again about them, right? And they're not acknowledging my lived experience.
Exactly.
And even if I perceived it as a microaggression, but it was a microaggression, let's just be clear. Like, what am I supposed to do as the one who's been victimized? Come back and to be like, but it's not about how you intended it. It's about how it impacted me. Can we talk about that?
Exactly. If you step on my foot, you may not have intended it, but it still hurts.
Right.
You know.
Exactly. And so I think hopefully art is being used in ways that helps us not just process our pain, but maybe elevate and celebrate these journeys.
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, I think it's processing, and I think it's making visible, and I think art has a way to address the messiness and complexity of who we are in a way that a lot of traditional research doesn't.
Absolutely.
Because you can pull from anywhere, and then it allows you to acknowledge your subjectivity.
Yes.
Which I think is one of those issues, that a claim to objectivity. I mean, objectivity is impossible, right? It's an impossibility.
I agree.
But in art, you can really make your subjectivity very visible. And that's what it's about, right?
It is. And I think that's why it's been so oppressed as well, right? Like the first kind of political prisoners, right, are always artists, right? Or part of the groups, right? Or that nature of elevating the subjective has always been squashed, traditionally in colonial contexts, for sure. And look what's happening right now, too. Right? It's like the subjective individual experience is being squashed by this dominant narrative of, coming back to your question, where am I authentically from? Like, what is nationalism? Like, what is this?
Right.
Like, what is happening in the world? But anyway, I'm so grateful. I guess it's to be continued.
Thank you. That would be great.
Thank you.
And I would
so
like
much
to come back eventually also to the U.S. versus American language. And that's a bigger conversation.
Oh
so
my
maybe
God,
we should
I
go
love
back to it later.
No, we definitely do,
Yes.
because I think it's such an important conversation to have. And well, we'll just see, because then we can also say that about Spanish too, right?
That's
and
right.
how
language.
It's so different and yet the same, isn't it? Right?
Yes.
Oh, I love it. Thank you
Thank
so
you. Thank you
much.
for inviting me to do this.
Oh, of course. My pleasure. And take care, okay? We'll be in touch.
Take care.
Bye.